All right, gang, today I'm going to talk about the key events or the main events of the Cold War, and this is going to be just a real quick highlighting of the major things. We're going to look a little bit more in detail about these tomorrow, but this, like I said, is just a quick highlight of the major events with a focus on the Vietnam War. So, in 1948, something occurred that led to the formation of NATO, and that was called the Berlin Airlift. In 1948 and 1949, what happened was the Soviets completely walled off Berlin. Now, if you think back, to a map that you've seen earlier. I don't have one on the PowerPoint. But if you think back, the capital city of Berlin was divided up amongst the four powers. The problem was that it was entirely in Eastern Germany or Eastern, the Soviet-occupied version. Well, what happened was the Soviets blocked all road access into Berlin. And so the Allies couldn't get access to it. And so the Allies began dropping food and water and regular everyday supplies to the people who lived in Western Berlin. And that was known as the Berlin Airlift. Well, kind of at the same time, NATO was formed. And then, like we've talked about before, the Warsaw Pact was formed in 1955 in response to NATO. Warsaw Pact was a defensive and economic alliance among the countries of Eastern Europe with the support of the Soviet Union. Well, in 1950, war broke out between communist North Korea and non-communist South Korea. And theoretically, what happened was this. Was that Stalin went ahead and the Chinese communists went ahead and told North Korea, hey, you guys go ahead and you invade South Korea and you take it back and unify your peninsula. So here's the thing. The reason that North Korea and South Korea were divided was because the Allies had to figure out what to do with Korea now that Japan was conquered. Well, just like in Europe, the Soviets and the U.S. decided to split things up. European powers didn't have any role in this, because they didn't really help liberate Korea. And so what was decided was that the North would be communist and the South would be democratic, or at least it would be maintained and run by USSR and the U.S. Well, what happened in the end result of this was yet again another war. So what happened was the Soviet Union, the North Korean communists wanted to go ahead and invade the South. Well, Stalin and the communists in China said, sure, go ahead, give it a shot. And so they tried. And they almost took over the entire peninsula and reunited Korea. But as a result of that, the U.S. got involved. And so we have what's known as a proxy war, a war that is between the U.S. and Soviet Union, but not actually between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. This is the first of a few proxy wars in which the U.S. fights communism to try to keep it contained. Now, another conflict, or a second major conflict, another major conflict in the Cold War was the building of the Berlin Wall. In September of 1961, what began happening was a lot of people began leaving communist Berlin, and East Berlin, and they were just going to the west, visiting family, and then sneaking across and going to Western Germany. What happened was Germany was losing, communist Germany was losing a lot of people. So to keep people from crossing the wall, they built a crossing over to to keep the Eastern Berliners from going to Western Germany. They built a wall around East Berlin. Okay, and not only around East Berlin, they surrounded all of Berlin, Western Berlin, in a wall that basically kept them in the middle of this communist country. And you couldn't go from one to the other freely. Okay, it was a big giant wall. And so it became a big deal to escape from Berlin. We'll watch a short video on that later tomorrow, but it becomes very difficult and it's divided up. This is a major conflict because the Soviets say, look, they support the communists in Germany, and the Germans have to maintain their population in order to maintain their communist country, because otherwise they're not going to have enough workers. Okay, and the living conditions were bad, and people didn't want to stay there, and so people began trying to escape. And so to keep people from escaping, they built a physical wall around Western Berlin, and they would shoot people that tried to cross over. Third major crisis, or fourth major event of the Cold War, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States got intelligence that said the Soviets, the Russians, had built missile silos, nuclear missile silos in Cuba. And we said, no. This is not going to happen. The reason they felt worried about this was because Cuba was in striking distance of Miami, and even within striking distance of intercontinental ballistic missiles to Washington. And we did not want that to happen. So what happened was this. The Americans called the Soviets, said, don't send over nuclear weapons. Do not put them in Cuba. Tensions got heated. Finally, what happens is both sides decided, hey, let's back down off of this. Let's not start the Third World War and possibly launch a crisis here. Let's not attack each other and start the Third World War. And let's back down from this. So John F. Kennedy and a guy named Nikita Khrushchev on the side of the Soviets negotiated this peace. And they both backed down. And we were really close to going to war for a span of about 13 days in October and November of 1962. We were really close to going to war with the Soviets, and that would have been a nuclear war. Well, we actually, yet another crisis and another proxy war was the Vietnam War in 1964 to 1973. We'll spend more detail on this in a second, but what happened in the Vietnam War was communist North Korea, or North Vietnam, wanted to become united with South Vietnam, and they began fighting over it. And even people in South Vietnam wanted to unite with the North, and the United States said, no, that's not going to happen. So we'll talk more in a minute about Vietnam, but let's talk about the nuclear threat, as I mentioned in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, both countries had nuclear weapons, and everybody knew that. And they began building up their arsenal. And this led to a tremendous arms race. Just like the arms race that led to the First World War, there was a tremendous arms race to see who could get the bigger, best weapons. And they got more and more and more. And this led to something called the Deterrence Theory, or the Mutually Assured Destruction Theory. The idea was this, that both sides had so many nuclear weapons that neither would attack, because if they did, the other would attack, and both would be mutually assured of their own destruction. MAD stands for Mutually Assured Destruction, and this kept each other from attacking because they thought it would lead to our destruction. Now, we'll look at some of the specific effects of MAD theory again. We'll look at some of these videos tomorrow. But what it led to was us preparing for fallout shelters. What it led to was us realizing that, hey, we've got to be very careful and prepping for this. But the nuclear threat also led us to the space race. And who could get to the moon and who could get to space faster? And what happened was this. The reason it became important to get to space was because if the other guys got to space, they knew that they had the capability, the ballistic capability to launch a nuclear weapon that could attack the other country. If they could send a weapon into space, it could go up in the air and then land on the other country. And so that led countries to go there. Now, the Soviets were the first to put a person in space. Okay, but we Americans were the first to get to the moon. And the race to the moon really kind of ended the Cold War. And there was even a race to see who could send the first animal into space. The Soviets sent a dog. We sent a monkey. The Soviets there was a race to send women. The Soviets portrayed us as inhumane, and not inhumane, but in treating women not as equal. And so they showed that, hey, we can send a woman into space because women are equal to men in the Soviet Union. Well, let's talk more specifically about the Vietnam War. Well, the French had a really important role to play in the Vietnam War, and here's why. Following World War II, if you'll remember, people wanted their independence, and colonialism really ended. Well, the French really didn't want to give that up in Vietnam. And that created a lot of tension, a lot of ill will, and a lot of distrust between two sides. And so the French eventually were driven out of Vietnam, in part by a guy named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a communist leader that led revolts against the French to push them out of Vietnam, and he also led the push for Vietnamese independence. Now, being that he was a communist, he wasn't very popular in America and with other capitalists, our allies. Okay? But what eventually happened was soon Vietnam became a divided country, much like Korea and much like Germany. North Vietnam was communist, South Vietnam was communist. But soon both sides began to be calling for unification. So as they were living as a divided nation, they began calling for independence. But our policy of containment would not allow this. We were really worried of something called the Domino Theory, that if one country fell to communism, then the other countries around it would fall to communism. So we were worried that when South Vietnam fell to communism, we worried that the rest of these countries would fall to communism as well, and that it would be expanded. And we could not have that as part of the containment or Truman policy. Well, so the United States entered the war in 1964 and began to fight and supply troops, supply advisors, and then eventually we had a draft to supply troops to keep the North Vietnamese from invading South Korea. Well, that became very unpopular. We actually began that war in 1964, and it became very unpopular in the United States, and we developed a lot of distrust for our government because of this. And eventually, we withdrew our troops in 1973. And the end result of all of this was that Vietnam was a communist country. It was eventually united, and today it remains a communist country. Now, they're communists in more or less the Chinese version. They export a lot of things to us. They produce a lot of goods, but their government is still a single-party communist, essentially a dictatorship, but it's not as harsh as the Soviet Union was. And like I said, they allow a lot of capitalism in terms of businesses and what they produce. So Vietnam became a united communist country, and it is still a united communist country today. But as we'll see, communism really didn't get exported and expand much beyond this area of Southeast Asia. All right, that's all for tonight. Talk to you guys later.